Hi, I'm Marty Gottrin. I'm here with Mary Philpott, who is the chief organizer of this quilt show and has been for many, many years, and we're very grateful for that.
Thank you.
And I'll turn this over to her to say a few words.
Thank you for joining us. This is our annual quilt show at the Lee Library. And again, this year we have some spectacular quilts. We hope you'll be inspired, and next year bring us your quilt. But we will have new quilters this year, as well as many of our returning quilters. So let's begin our tour.
This quilt is by Sharon Chandler. It's called Scrappy Ever After. It's done in holiday prints. It's an interesting pattern using scraps. This could be used, I'm going to walk over and show you, try to show you. Maybe I need to start out over here. You can see that these are blocks, and I'm not quite sure where she began and ended them, but there's horizontal ones here, and then 3 vertical ones above it, and then horizontal 3, and then 2 of the horizontal ones here. These are vertical, sorry. And so she's done that, many, many squares of that, and then she's combined them in interesting patterns with both the pattern in the material and the pattern in the way she's laid them out to give a very colorful and fun Christmas quilt. You could use this pattern actually to do a lot of things, like make a table runner, make placemats. It could be, if you wanted to make it bigger, it could be a throw, sort of like this one, or a blanket. This particular quilt is for sale. It's costs $50, or that's the price tag on it. And if anyone is interested, they should just stop at the Lee Library desk.
Our next quilt is also by Sharon Chandler, and this one's called Yesteryear Memories. This quilt is also done in holiday fabrics, and we have lovely snow scenes alternating with solid squares and a holly border. This wall hanging is machine quilted. This quilt has also been generously donated to the Lee Library, and we look forward to displaying it for many years. This next quilt is by Barbara Kubley. This is titled Fallen Leaves, and this is a combination of 2 different quilt squares, a 9-patch square and then one with half-square triangles. And if you alternate these 2 squares in different configurations, as Barbara has done here, you create other designs that you can see in this piece. And this is a very lovely piece, and the falling leaves are bordering this whole piece.
This bird is by me. It's based on a photo that my husband John Felton took. It's of a marbled godwit, which is a shorebird. We saw this one in Florida, I believe. It's collaged, which means I've used several different fabrics, just like you would collage with paper or anything else. They're glued down and then quilted over both the bird and the background fabric.
The quilting on this piece is really interesting because the way it's done, you can actually see the rippling in the water and the shadowing in the water. So you see different shades of grays, and you see how the sun is hitting the water. So it's done very well. Thank you, Marty, for sharing this with us.
This is a wood duck from a photo, again from a photo that my husband took. This was in Central Park, and the light that day was very strange. Gave everything kind of a lavender hue. Wood ducks are not normally quite this color. Again, this is a collage, putting lots of little pieces of fabric together to try to make it look like the thing you want it to look like. And it was a challenge, but also a great fun to do.
And again, there's some wonderful quilting on the background for the water, but also on the feathers, which you can see and gives a real clear view of how the placement of the feathers is on this bird. This next quilt is done by Elizabeth Leonard, and it's titled Aviary. And this is made entirely by hand and is an example of wood applique. 2 designers, Dawn Heath of Linen Closet Designs and Bonnie Sullivan, who's from All Through the Night, formed a Facebook wool applique group, a block of the month. And this is Elizabeth's version from Dawn Heath's kit, and it's quilted by Claudette Dupuis. And you can see some wonderful birds in this quilt. And each of these birds is quite different from the other, some in pairs, some in singles, and they are all done by hand. And then there's shadow quilting around the flowers and around the birds so they stand out even more. And this is a very interesting piece.
This quilt is by Sin Smith, who's had many quilts in Lee Library shows over the years. It's called Domestic Arts. Unlike the fine arts, domestic arts are the utilitarian objects done with beauty and thoughtful design. Such are quilts. Many quilts cross over into art with color, pattern, and texture that please the eye. This quilt was made for my bedroom and is domestic art. She is surely right when she says that it is domestic art. The quilting in this is absolutely gorgeous. All of these little curves are not easy to do. It's just the color is beautiful and restful. It's just a lovely, lovely quilt.
Mary T. Cody presents us with a crazy quilt with hand embroidery. This crazy quilt was started by her dear sister, Madeline Seward. Sadly, Madeline passed away in October 2018, and Mary could appreciate all the time and hard work that her sister put into this, but it was left unfinished. So Mary has finished this quilt with love and in her memory. And you can see in this quilt, it's a very old pattern, and all these different pieces are just put onto the backing, and then decorative stitching is done around some of the pieces, and the decorative stitching is all by hand. So this is a very beautiful piece of work with great memories in it. Our next quilt is by Connie Logan, and it's titled Merry Christmas. And this is truly a spectacular quilt, and this is entirely done by hand. And Connie wrote that she has a seasonal quilt hanging in her living room throughout the year, and this Christmas one was completed several years ago. And when you look closely at this quilt, you'll see some of the details. From tiny buttons on the gingerbread men, there are beads as embellishments on the tops of cupcakes, and there's all kinds of embroidery between the snowmen, but especially the quilting in the center, which goes around the Santa and all the different groups of pictures or groups of applique, and then you have a different kind of quilting on the border. But all together, this really makes a fabulous piece.
This quilt is by Mitchell Q. Sellers, who is a new exhibitor in this quilt show this year. He's titled it Not Black and White, and I think it's pretty obvious why he's called it that. This is just really a riot of color. There's movement in each of the blocks. They're twirling and spinning, and there's movement in the quilting itself. If you look in the black squares and follow them across, it's a quilt pattern of waves going across, and then they end up in the stripes on the border.
This next quilt is quite unusual, and it is created by Jean O'Neill, and this is also a new exhibitor to our quilt show this year. And this is called The Farm at Farl Haines. And this was inspired by a land survey map of the 1880s of Jean's ancestral homeland in County Cork, Ireland. And this quilt has incredible quilting. In each of these little pieces, you can see quilting that looks like it makes it like rows of farming, some like water. There are all around the edges stones that bordered the land. There are the farmhouses, and in the lower part, there's a little man sitting on the rocks. And this is quite an interesting piece. The squares are about 4 inches by 3 inches. Some are much smaller, but the quilting inside each of these squares is really quite incredible. And this quilt has been displayed in Dublin, in London, and in Houston. And so we are very pleased to be able to show you this quilt this year. This next quilt is done by Jan Tuckman, and Jan is a returning exhibitor. This quilt is titled Grandchildren's Bubbles, and one of the fabrics that's used in this square looks like little bubbles erupting. And this quilt is created from a 4-patch square, and by alternating the direction of the square, you can create a very interesting pattern of darks and lights with all the bubbles rambling through it. And so this is what you have in this quilt. Our next quilt is quite fabulous. This was created by Marcia Dolman, and it's called Dear Jane Revisited. Marcia's good friend Barbara Tryon, who was liked by so many people, made 50 blocks for this quilt in a class taught by Connie Logan. Before Barbara died, she gave these pieces that she had made to Marcia, and Marcia made 50 more pieces. And so we have, as a result, this fabulous quilt. And so we have quite a number of things to say on it. But one of the things is how small some of these pieces are. So I just want to show you right here this little tiny triangle, these half-square triangles right here. And I believe most of these pieces were done by hand. And they exhibit lots of techniques, and they exhibit, mostly are done by hand, and they exhibit different kinds of patterns and different kinds of fabrics.
In fact, Mary and I have not been able to find any duplication of the squares. There are variations, but there don't seem to be any particular duplications. I'm also impressed with the use of the black and the blue, and maybe it's not even black, maybe it's a very dark navy, it's a little hard to tell, along with the beige and the white. I think they have just done a beautiful job of putting all of these together in a very pleasing way.
And maybe I can point out this piece here. It has the tiniest curves going in here, and the points on where these curves intersect is just incredible. And so there are many things like that. One of the things, there's another quilt here that has, this square has fussy cutting. So these pieces were specifically cut out so that they would capture that blue rose. And one of the things that Marcia said about this was that it was a joy to do this quilt, but it was also very hard to do. And it was hard to get those little points to come together. And not only that, but they had a lot of do-overs, which is very difficult after doing something so spectacular to have to rip it out because it wasn't quite perfect. But what you see is this absolutely phenomenal quilt here. The next quilt is by Cindy Smith, and it's called Circle of Friends. This quilt is owned by Heather and Bill Ketchum. This quilt was pieced and quilted by Cindy. This quilt was made to celebrate friendship and the family we choose. The sunflowers represent one side of the friendship and the oak leaves the other. The central pattern is interconnected circles that create an optical illusion. And this is like a burst of autumn under the oak trees. And these are fabulous oak leaves and all around the edge of this quilt. And beautiful sunflowers with so many fabrics in them that create dimension and they create light. And this is wonderful quilting all around the edge, which has also a pattern of leaves in it. So you can see those oak leaves are also quilted around between the fabric oak leaves. You also have the quilted oak leaves. And then the center with all these swirls, you create lots of movement and lots of patterns. This is another one of Cindy Smith's fabulous quilts.
This quilt, Yosemite National Park, is done by Amy Dunn. It's a printed black fabric that she has put borders around, and she's used really nice colors to bring out the colors in the printed panel itself. It was machine quilted by Betty King.
Jean P. O'Neill has created this quilt called Berkshire Tulips. And Jean loves being in her garden and the tulips and seeing her tulips that give her a sure sign that spring is here. And in this quilt, she has a burst of these tulips, and you can see them all around the edge of the quilt, and each one is an appliqued piece on to the quilt, as well as the leaves. And this is a very sweet quilt and has wonderful quilting patterns to it. And you can see a serenity to this quilt and a calmness. And it's just created by the colors, the fabric, and this wonderful quilting.
This quilt is by Betty King. It's called The Warmth of Our Stars. The pattern was featured in a 6-month series in Love of Quilting, which is a Fons and Porter magazine familiar to many quilters. It was designed by Scott Flanagan, pieced and machine quilted by Betty King. And this quilt, too, is for sale. This is a really interesting quilt. It has a lot of different patterns in it. The one in the center is obviously a star. There are stars all throughout it, different places. This is the flying geese pattern. This is a
Log cabin.
A log cabin pattern, and then just the lovely little squares going around the corner, going around the border here. Was, I think, machine quilted. Did I say that? Yes. And it's just a lovely job. Very nice colors. Again, a restful quilt.
And very nicely quilted with some big half moon kind of feather stitches, and goes around each of the circles and creates lots of interesting patterns to look at. And this definitely would be a 6-month series to do all these patterns in quilting.
This piece was made by Elizabeth Leonard. It's called A Walk in the Woods. It came from Granny's Legacy Pattern, a pattern making company that offered a stitching school. Elizabeth used a purchase kit to create this piece. I think we're going to do a little bit of a close-up. There are so many different things in this quilt, and you really have to look for them to find them. But a couple of them are, for instance, a butterfly, mushrooms.
We have columbine.
Yeah, columbine.
Toward the border.
There's a praying mantis in here somewhere.
Right over here.
Yeah, right over there. All different kinds of flowers. So when you come in to look at this show, you really should spend a little bit of time trying to discover all of the delightful things in this quilt.
And this quilt is made from wool applique, and it's also all done by hand. And you can see all kinds of embroidery stitches around the flowers to accent the leaves as well. And to do the pieces, the parts of the flowers are all hand embroidered. This is really quite a spectacular piece, and it does require quite a bit of searching as we were looking for trillium and some of the other pieces, and some of the flowers have gone to seed, which is false Solomon seal, which is there. And so this is really a very interesting piece, and so we hope you'll come and look at it. This next quilt is called a Hawaiian quilt, and it was created by Connie Logan, who has taught many classes. And Connie has done this quilt entirely by hand. Hawaiian quilts are a style of quilts with plants and flowers depicted in the design. And if you see this quilt, you'll see that there are no printed fabrics in it. These are solid colors. And this is how Hawaiian quilts are created. And then there's echo quilting done around here. And this echo quilting is done all around each of these flowers to imitate the shape of the flower and the leaves. Each of these lines of quilting, which is hand done, is 1/2 inch from the next line. This is quite an incredible amount of work that's involved in this quilt. And this pattern was from the Quilter's newsletter. And this is really quite spectacular.
This quilt is also by Mitchell Q. Sellers. It's called Off Kilter, and again, that's for fairly obvious reasons, I think. He uses bright colors, as he did in the previous quilt. There are layers of... It's an interesting pattern. There's a hexagon. No, it's not a hexagon. It's a pinwheel in the middle, and then the blocks that it's on are all cut so on the diagonal, not really diagonal, what do you call it?
In triangles?
Triangles.
In triangles.
Yeah.
And off kilter.
And off kilter.
As this is called. And this is a huge quilt. And so we are showing you only probably part of it, but we want you to see the entire piece, what it looks like. And again, another riot of color.
And this quilt is also for sale on Etsy and also a site called MQ Quilts.
So now we want to show you the back side of the off kilter, and this is the back side, and it has a huge panel in the center, and it's got several pieces that are pieced to give you this beautiful back side of this quilt, and another riot of color that surrounds it.
This quilt is by Amy Dunn, who also made the Yosemite quilt on the wall over there. It is, again, panels of the national parks, which she has put a lovely border around, and then Betty King quilted it. It has a very interesting back. We'll try to show you that. It's smaller cards of the actual national parks. The material comes from Pumpkin Patch Quilts here in Lee, and I was in there the other day, and they were telling me that a man came in who had just bought a RV and was planning on traveling around the country in it for a couple of years, and he fell in love with this fabric and bought some. He's making curtains out of it for his van, I guess a couple of other things as well, and his goal is to go to as many of these national parks as he possibly can. It's kind of a lovely story.
It is. It's a great story that goes well with this fabric. All these beautiful pot holders are part of our pot holder project that we do each year when we have the quilt show. Volunteers donate pot holders, and these pot holders are sold, and if there's any left over, donated. And the money that comes from the sale of these pot holders goes to our local food pantry. So this is really a win-win project. The quilters who have extra little scraps get rid of some of their extra little scraps and create these beautiful pot holders. People who buy them have a very lovely gift to give or something very nice to keep for themselves. And then the food pantry also benefits with either the money from the pot holders or any leftover pot holders. So people who use the food pantry will also have a very nice pot holder. I hope you've enjoyed our show. We've had a wonderful time showing you these quilts and telling you a little bit about the quilting techniques and the people that made them. And so thank you also to CTSB for taping the show each year. And thank you to the Lee Library and to the Pumpkin Patch Quilt Shop for their support and their sponsorship. And thank you, Marty, for joining me on this tour.
My pleasure.
I appreciate all your comments and your quilts, too. Thank you.